I am Victor Williams,
I am Christy Tucci.
and this is Conspiracy Hotbox. Today we are going to be discussing the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the conspiracy theories that sprang up in its wake. First, let's find out a little bit about the man. Who was Martin Luther King Jr., Christy?
Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and he subsequently died in Memphis, Tennessee. He mainly spoke out on social injustices at the time, and he was pretty much the figurehead for the civil rights movement.
He represented the other side of the coin, that people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, kind of the yin and the yang. Martin Luther King Jr. Subscribed to a more Gandhi-esque, nonviolent approach to the injustices of the time, believing that it was through nonviolence and passive interaction that men really regained their dignity. Although he was targeted in the same way that Malcolm X was. He was seen to represent a very powerful undercurrent that was going at the time, not only in the African American community, but also, in protesters of the Vietnam War. This was kind of all happening at this time, and he was really the first, we'll say, martyr almost, is what it ended up being.
Well, not only was he this major social activist, but he was also the youngest man ever at 35 years of age to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent resistance to the racial prejudice.
So the official story on this is that James Earl Ray, acting alone, killed Martin Luther King Jr. with one bullet that was fired from across the street from a boarding house bathroom window that James Earl Ray had taken up residence recently at for $8.50 a week. $8.50 he was able to obtain. That's cheap. That's a good deal. When he was arrested, he was, I don't want to say railroaded. He was definitely rushed through the legal process, and maybe not, in a lot of people's opinion, not given due process. He was, well, what did his lawyer offer?
Well, his lawyer encouraged him to plead guilty, obviously, to avoid the electric chair. So James Earl Ray, siding with his legal counsel, agreed to plead guilty, did so, and then within 3 days of that guilty plea, he retracted his statement, saying that.
No, he had a whole other story that went with it, and it varied throughout the years. He told pretty much anybody who would listen. He died in prison in 1998, but until then, he had many moments where the spotlight came back on him and back on this case. This is obviously a very old case, and in that time, a lot has sprung up around it, kind of like the JFK assassination, which preceded this by 3 years.
JFK was in 63.
Okay, 5 years.
Yeah,
5
and then
years.
Malcolm X was in 65. It was the era of assassinations.
Yeah, pretty much. So I guess to really begin with the conspiracy is go over the obscene amount of people who wanted him dead, besides the odd assortments of white supremacists. It was suggested that supporters of segregationist presidential candidate George Wallace had at one time offered a $50,000 bounty.
as well as the KKK of Mississippi, put out a bounty supposedly of $100,000 to any man or woman who would kill Martin Luther King Jr.
As well as the mafia has supposedly had a bounty on him at one time. It was also proven in years since that Martin Luther King Jr. had been on numerous watch lists, governmental agency, intelligence agencies. The NSA had him on the watch list. The FBI had begun to monitor him as early as December of 1955 during his involvement with the Montgomery bus boycott, under the pretense that he was acting in accordance with communist dictates, pretty much. This was the age of communism. We can liken it to modern day terrorism. And this was the big scare back then, that there was these communist demons that were behind the scenes pulling strings to further the Communist Manifesto. But every conspiracy theory has its grains of truth, which contribute to the overall picture. Starting with the legal processes of James Earl Ray, other than him not being really given a due process.
Ultimately what ended up happening with the retracting of his statement, the judge who, Judge Battle, was in charge of the case at the time, he actually ended up dying of a heart attack in the midst of James Earl Ray petitioning this motion for a retrial in the wake of his recantation. And he passed away before making that decision. So his successor on the case ended up promptly denying Ray's request for a retrial.
It was also suggested that Martin Luther King may have alluded to his own upcoming death. His final speech was delivered on April 3rd, and many of the words within the speech seem to allude to his foreknowledge of his impending doom. And until her own death in 2006, his wife, Coretta Scott King, firmly believed that there was
a high level of conspiracy.
Yeah.
Involving government.
She thought everybody
agencies,
was in on it.
Everyone except actually James Earl Ray.
Yeah.
She, along with her children, the King family, they all believed that James Earl Ray was innocent. His one son actually went and visited Ray in prison and was pleading his innocence.
At this time, James Earl Ray had said that a mysterious man named Raoul, who was, in James Earl Ray's words, a gun runner with ties to the mafia, had pretty much set him up, and that James Earl Ray was a patsy. He was the fall guy. James Earl Ray was instructed to purchase a rifle by Raoul and then leave the rifle in his room at the boarding house, and then was instructed, according to James Earl Ray, to go see
a 3-hour movie.
3-hour movie.
And during that 3-hour time period is supposedly when the assassination occurred.
Coincidences abound.
I'd like to know what that 3-hour movie was.
It was a matinee. To his death, denied that he was the one who actually took the shot. Interestingly enough, a man named Lloyd Jowers, who was the owner of the restaurant that was adjacent to this boarding house, actually came forth in 1993 and stated that the mafia had paid him $1,000 to plan King's assassination.
$100,000.
$100,000. That was big bucks back then.
That a gentleman named Frank Holt actually pulled the trigger.
Now, what it wasn't clear is if Frank Holt was the police officer that he had ultimately identified. According to Lloyd Jowers, the fatal shot came from a rifle fired by a Memphis police officer. At which point, the Memphis police officer passed off the murder weapon to Lloyd Jowers. Lloyd Jowers breaks down the rifle, passes it off to Raoul. Here, Raoul appears again, this mysterious gun runner.
Man.
Yeah, he sounds Cuban, right? It would tie in with the communist scare. Passes off this rifle, and this rifle remains at the bottom of the Mississippi River. And the rifle that was actually seized by police, which was conveniently placed in the doorway of an adjacent building, with only the fingerprints of James Earl Ray, was this rifle that he had been instructed to purchase.
But ballistic tests weren't even able to confirm nor deny that that was the actual rifle used in the assassination.
This particular rifle did not leave grooves that are associated with forensic ballistics. They weren't able to, quote, pull a print from the bullet. So it was all very murky. And you know, this is the before the 70s era, really, of forensic analysis, and nothing compared to what we have today. So, you know, these things weren't even necessarily brought up. Again, there was no real criminal trial.
It was sent through the court system very quickly.
These were all things that James Earl Ray would be yelling about until his dying day. Whenever he would have a chance, he would always bring up this collusion with this mystery man, Raoul, the gun runner, with the mafia connections. And the ring of truth to this is that we do know that at that time the mafia did have a lot more power than they do today. They pretty much ran the criminal underpinnings, not only in the United States, but also in a lot of other nomadic countries where communism was actually a real issue. And this was just a different time. This was a different time, and these agencies, the FBI and the CIA, they've been implicated in a lot of different shady activity, which is why this conspiracy theory has persisted. You know, there's a lot of unanswered questions. You know, and Coretta King still insists that there's abundant evidence of a major high-level conspiracy in the assassination of her husband. A civil suit actually was filed by her against Lloyd Jowers, and he was found guilty to have been involved in the criminal death of Martin Luther King Jr., but there is a loophole that does not allow the results of a civil suit to overturn findings of a criminal investigation. So there was nothing that really came of that, other than the jury found that the mafia and various government agencies were deeply involved in the assassination, and Mr. A was set up to take the blame. But we may never know. Christy, what is your ultimate verdict?
I think that James Earl Ray was a patsy. I think that it was a setup. I think there was a higher force at work behind the assassination, and we will never know. But there was a lot of too many questions to be definitive to say James Earl Ray was the lone gunman.
The lone gunman. I love wrapping it up nice and neatly with that title. And with that, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you guys for listening, and tune in to some more episodes are on the way.